Hi. We're going to talk about another little topic here, charter schools. It's the 25th anniversary of the first national charter authorization law, and it's been 20 years since DC first had charters. Still, charter schools nationally only enroll about 2.5 million students, which is a pretty small number when you look at it nationally. And we are really obsessed with charter schools. And I want, one of the reasons that is because charter schools are becoming a huge piece of the market in some of our most troubled cities. So in New Orleans, for example, 93% of kids are in charter schools. In Detroit, it's 54%. In Flint, Michigan, it's 47%. And here in DC, it's 44%. Philadelphia is getting to a third of kids in charter schools. And these are places where children desperately need a good education and where it's still not clear they're getting one. So even some of the most successful charter schools are finding that their kids are getting to college, but then not getting through college. So today we're going to talk about what charter schools are doing to evolve 25 years later. And I'm going to put the first question to Scott. This is an easy one. One of the main criticisms of charters is that even if they don't intend to, they end up with the families that are savviest, that are actually making the choice to go there. So naturally they're going to do better because these kids are better prepared, better supported. So how do we know if they're working?
Well, the issue of selection bias has been something that researchers on charter schools have been aware of since the very beginning, and they've developed some really sophisticated tools for trying to control for that. So, for example, you have researchers who will look just at families who applied to the school and compare how did the students do who got in versus how did the students do who didn't, and then you control for that motivation. Mm-hmm. And most of the best studies have shown that, on average, currently, charter schools are slightly outperforming traditional public schools across the country, but there's wide variations. And in jurisdictions like DC, they're vastly outperforming the traditional public schools. And in other jurisdictions, like, for example, Nevada, they're significantly underperforming.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions, connected to that is that not very many charter schools actually do turnarounds where they go in and take over a school that's struggling and deal with the kids that are already there. And I'm wondering if, Scott, I'll put this to you, but Dahlia and Shantelle, if you have thoughts as well, should charters be doing more to reach those kids who aren't choosing to go to a charter school?
I think absolutely, but I would turn it over to Shantelle because Shantelle is a charter school leader who has actually done a turnaround.
Yeah.
So, I think at the end of the day, the schools belong to scholars, and they belong to the community, and I think that charter schools, traditional public schools, have an obligation to make sure they're serving the community that they're located in. I don't think that we should mandate one way or the other for charters to take over district schools or district schools to take over charters. I think that parents want great schools, and they don't really care about the shingle. They just want a great quality school in their neighborhood. We did take over an existing charter school, and very much so for that reason, that the children were in that building, and the children needed a good education, and we were there to serve that community. I don't think it's for everyone. It's a hard task, and I don't think we should be experimenting on children, and so if you're not ready to do that and take on a task like that, I don't think it's something that everybody should do.
Mm-hmm. As you've seen this huge expansion, especially in DC, how do you maintain the quality? How do you make sure these are good schools that are taking over?
Well, that, to me, is where the job of the charter school authorizer comes in. They're the ones who decide who opens, who closes, and who gets to grow. And it's not that hard, really. What you first of all say is, if you're already running a school, you can't grow unless you've demonstrated really strong results. And so the very best schools grow, and the ones who aren't doing as well don't grow. And then you do your best to only approve to open the most promising new applications. Sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you don't. And when you don't get it right, you make the tough decision to close that school. And if you do all those things rigorously and without regard to political pressures, you will end up over time with a group of charter schools who are really good.
Shantelle, you guys are expanding next year to your third campus. How do you replicate success? Do you lose something And how do you make sure you're sort of taking your best practices?
Yeah, so I think that for us, we're going into our 8th year, and we were very intentional about our growth and making sure that, one, the growth was something that the community wanted and that we were actually meeting a need of the community. And then two, that we had thought about the structures and systems that we needed to make sure that we could be successful from day one. We're very intentional about thinking and knowing that we have a child for a very finite amount of time, and every single minute with that child counts. But I do think with any organization, whether it be a school or a business, you do take some hits around quality when you replicate, because everything is not perfect and everything doesn't always work out. But I think when you have a commitment of the adults, you have the support of your authorizer, your community, it can be easier. But we definitely take a hit. And I think one of the things we learned very quickly after we grew to our second campus is that excellence is fragile. It's not something that you can just box up and take with you. The community is different, the scholars are different, the teaching staff you get is different. But I do think when you have good ingredients, you can use those, and as Scott said, hopefully end up with stronger schools for children.
And I'd say what Shantelle did and what we see in the schools who replicate well is that they spend extra money before they replicate in growing leaders for their school. So they don't say, oh, we're going to open a new school and we'll hire someone really good. They take someone in their organization, they put them in the role of assistant principal, maybe as a second assistant principal because they already have one, but they'll spend that money to have that person have experience running the school. And so then when they grow, that person is ready to move into the new school and really take the culture and the way of doing things into the new campus.
Mm-hmm. And for a school like Mundo Verde that hasn't chosen to replicate, we finally have 5th grade coming this next year and we'll be full, right, for our charter. We believe that there's a lot of impact to be made in sharing of practice. So we're a school that's focused on dual immersion in English and Spanish. We're focused on sustainability. We're an EL education school. And there's so much to be learned from those practices that can be replicated in other schools that doesn't involve sort of just taking the entire school and replicating it. So I think sort of having this diversity is one of the successes of charter schools, really having the diversity that parents demand. We have one of the 2nd largest waiting lists in the city, and who knew that, right? You'd have a really long waiting list.
Shouldn't you expand though, Dahlia? If people are demanding your school, is there some do you feel like some obligation that we should open another campus somewhere?
I just think about what Shantelle said, right? I mean, it's not definitely, excellence is not something that's just really easily replicated immediately. And I feel like there is still so much to be learn from our model. We have schools visiting us from Colorado, from New York, from other places where they're interested in these practices, and I think that impact is just as powerful as creating an entirely new school.
Mm-hmm. Scott, I have a question about, here in DC, you're getting to 44% of kids in charters. What's the goal, and is there an ideal balance of charters and regular public schools, and then is there a tipping point where the district starts to have its resources drained from all of these schools that are sort of pulling money away?
I think the goal varies from city to city. In DC, we have a strong traditional public school system. They didn't used to be, but they've gotten really good. And what we found is that there's a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who like going to traditional public schools. They like having a neighborhood school of Wright that they can walk to. They like the predictability of the feeder patterns. And so for us, having a strong traditional school alongside of a strong portfolio of charter schools actually gives parents more choice because they can choose one or the other. So we think that a rough balance, and whether that's 44% or 54%, I can't say, but a rough balance is right for DC. But if you're in a city where the traditional public school system is just hopelessly broken, it may be just a moral wrong to say, oh, we should try to maintain some sort of percentage for those schools. If the charter schools are significantly outperforming and providing students with a better education, that may be the right choice for that particular city.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about the no excuses model, which is sort of the stereotype of charter schools, kids in lines and uniforms, silent lunches. There's been this big shift in the charter school world. It's been fairly quiet, where actually a lot of schools, KIPP is sort of the archetype of the no excuses model, but you're seeing their progressive ideas like social emotional learning, restorative justice, trauma-informed schooling. So I want to put to Shantelle and Dahlia, one, where do you put yourself on the scale with 10 is no excuses, 0 is a Waldorf school, and then why did you choose that? Why did you choose that model?
I think we're towards the Waldorf and the no excuses. I think we feel fundamentally that it's really important to consider how you're meeting each child's needs. We think it's really important to think about how you integrate families into helping resolve the challenges that students have. And so for us, this notion that sort of all kids can achieve in the same way, regardless of what their background is a little foolhardy. That said, we do believe that all kids can accomplish great things when the right amount of resources put in front of them, when they have access to field work and research and experts, as we do in EL education schools, that you can, in many ways, level, right, the playing field. I think a lot of people have talked about that here today. And so I think for us, we find ourselves on the end of really asking, how can we help, how can we support high accountability, but also high support for students and teachers.
Chantelle, what about you guys?
So I think it's very interesting because I think this whole concept of no excuses has gotten a bad rap. So clearly you can tell which end I would say we are probably closer to what is deemed as the tradition of no excuses. But for us, we think about it very differently. The no excuses has nothing to do with the children. It has no excuses for the adults that are in the building. And we're very intentional about that. You can't make excuses for who you serve. You can't make excuses for your data and why children aren't learning. You can't make excuses for why your school is chaotic and things aren't happening. So we hold adults to very high standards. And we think about, so, I think that when you think about this whole no excuses now and people being, I think there's some things happening in schools that need to stop, that are reflective of our country, that are reflective of the biases that exist, that are holding certain segments of our population back. They need to stop, and they're happening in our schools, they're happening in our businesses, they're happening in our communities, period. So they need to stop. But when I think about schooling for us, we are very clear that children can't learn in chaos. And it's our job, as Paul talked a lot about in his segment that he just went, to create systems and structures that support children, that hear from the community, that are making sure that we're creating spaces where children can be successful, where children can succeed. And so when we think about no excuse, it has absolutely nothing to do with the children. It has everything to do with the adults and what we've said about children that we serve, what they look like, their zip code, what they can and can't do, and we just don't accept that.
Is there anything that you guys have changed in your model over the years?
No. Not, I think we've tried to get better, in terms of instructional shifts, but when we think about it, we've always been a place that thought about things in terms of a warm, strict. For our children, they need consistency. They need to be able to have an environment that they can navigate. They know what's expected from classroom to classroom. They know what's expected of them. It has nothing to do with holding them to some higher standard because they're Black or they're poor. 100% of our children look like me. They come from environments that I came from, and I know that the consistency that I got in terms of being able to navigate education is what changed my life and changed my trajectory, and that's what happens for the children that we serve. But it's not about zero tolerance, if you will. And I think that there are some schools out there that are doing those things that need to stop, but I also don't think that that means every school needs to come in and just, do whatever you like for the day. I think that Paul talked a lot about it in terms of the obligation that we have to make sure that children get the skills and characteristics and things that they need to be successful.
And Dahlia, you guys are talking about being a suspensionless school. So how are you going about that? What does that look like?
I think for us, it means really making sure that all teachers are a lot more gifted in the kind of research that Paul was referencing, really the effects of shame on school environment, the effects of shame on students, and their capacity to really grow the skills that are needed to problem solve, to get along with others, right, to resolve conflicts. For us, it really means making sure that all teachers are more steeped in those strategies that have their roots in restorative justice, that we really are looking for what is going to change behavior over time, not what's immediately going to remove a challenge from a teacher or from other students. And for us, that's really important as part of our model, that we're an inclusive school, which means we take all students regardless of their background, regardless of their challenges. But to us, those are also assets and gifts. There's something we learn from watching how a child perseveres from something they don't know and are unable to confront, to being able to manage and negotiate later with support from adults in their community.
Scott, have you seen changes in just the culture of charter schools, their models here in DC generally?
We have. We have schools that are more like Chantelle's, where they have very consistent practices, and they have very clear expectations of how children behave. But what we've seen is that some of our schools had those, and then the consequence of violating those was that the student would be suspended, for example, or in some cases expelled. not Shantelle, but other schools. And in some cases, we saw schools 3 years ago where half the student body over the course of the year might be suspended. And that no longer happens, and we addressed it actually in an interesting way. We've seen other places where they say, you may not suspend or you may not do this. And to us, that is fundamentally inconsistent with the charter model, where these are independent schools who need to find their own way forward in concert with their community. So what we did was we started publishing the data, and people could see, oh, this school suspended half their children. And schools didn't like seeing that they were at the top of this list, and so they started having, and in many cases their boards had no idea, right? So then their board saw this and had conversations with the executive director of the school, and so the numbers started coming down. And what we've seen is that schools can continue to maintain the really structured environment that has worked for them, but they can do it in a way where the consequence of not following that structure isn't that you're excluded from the building, which I think is important.
I want to bring up a question before we turn it over to the audience for questions. One of the issues or criticisms that charters have faced is that they help resegregation of students. But I want to raise the issue of teacher diversity, which is something that doesn't get talked about as much. But in New Orleans, for example, the teaching force went from 70% Black before Katrina to 47% Black today, now that it's a mostly charter district. And I'm curious what it looks like here in D.C., and in charter schools, is teacher diversity something that's important? There's research showing that it does matter that kids have teachers that look like them. And how do you, Shantelle and Dahlia, think about that?
So, I think one of the great things about being a charter is the autonomy that you have to hire your staff and who you believe is best for your children. For us, it's very important that our staff is reflective of our student population. At the end of the day, though, we want the best people in front of children. We don't, they could be purple, as long as they are good at getting their brain stronger so they can be smarter for us. But it is important, and it is something that we think about, and we think about, particularly, I'm a leader of color, and I want to make sure that my school is reflective of that. My school is 100%, 99% African American, 89% free and reduced lunch. So we want to make sure that our scholars have examples of what this looks like for them and what this could be for them. But at the end of the day, we want the best people. And I think that being an autonomous school, one of the things that comes with that is the ability to pick and choose who you want. And I think it depends on each school leader and what they focus on. But at the end of the day, I think people just want the best people in front of children.
And Dahlia, you have a diverse student body, but talk about your teachers.
Yeah, I'll talk about both because I think they're both important to us. Again, we're a school that sees diversity as an asset. We were very sort of forthright in seeking out populations that might not come to us automatically, as you said. It's not sort of like the most resource parents getting to the table first. And so we end up with a very diverse population. About a third of our kids are African American, a third are Latino, about a third are white, and then we have a real diverse mix of everybody else. And for us, it is important then to make sure that that same diversity is mirrored in our personnel. We're not there yet. So a majority of our teachers are teachers of color. That mostly falls in the Latino, category, because we want really high-performing teachers in Spanish who can deliver curriculum at high levels in Spanish. But we know that if we're going to really serve students in Washington, D.C., we have to have more models of African-American teachers in our school. And I think it's been a challenge to sort of draw teachers to this particular mission that really focuses on dual immersion. So people hear English, they hear Spanish, they don't quite know where they fit in with sustainability at Yale education. But we hope over time, as diverse as our student body is, we'll begin to draw teachers and educators who not only are diverse in their own identity, but also understand the importance of transformative education around equity. Like, how do you teach students to undo racism, to undo different types of oppression, and that they're willing to deliver a curriculum that helps students do that.
And I want to open it up to questions from the audience.
Malcolm Barnes, education reporter for Community Digital News. Question to Scott. What data points or objective measures do you have to support your contention that these charter schools are vastly outperforming DC public schools?
The most significant study, there's a few. One is done by an organization called CREDO, the Center for Research on Educational Outcomes, that uses very sophisticated statistical techniques to try to control for this selection bias, that found that a student at a public charter school in Washington, D.C. got the equivalent of 70 to 100 extra days worth of learning each year. So that is one. The National Assessment of Educational Progress shows that students in charter schools outperform, although that, of course, doesn't control for the selection bias that we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Another question.
Hi, Galen Carey, National Association of Evangelicals. How do teacher retention rates compare at charters versus traditional public schools and private schools, if you know? And if there are differences, what accounts for them?
Mm-hmm.
I would say on the whole that teacher retention rates at charter schools are lower. They tend to have higher turnover of teachers. I think there's many reasons for that, one of which is that charter schools tend to hire younger teachers, and those teachers stay in education for a couple of years. But when I look across our schools, I see wide ranges. I mean, anytime you talk about charter schools, you're never going to be able to generalize because they're so diverse. And we have charter schools where all their teachers stay year after year, and we have charter schools where there's a lot of turnover. And generally, lower turnover is weakly correlated with higher performance, but not exclusively. Some schools thrive on a model where teachers come for a few years and leave, and that's not unlike other sectors as well.
Have you guys focused on teacher retention? I'm curious.
Yeah, we have about 95% retention, and we've been pretty thoughtful and intentional about what are the characteristics of a school that keeps teachers. We've tried to incentivize in ways that we can't necessarily in salary compared to the district, but at the same time, we find we're really attracting teachers who are mission-driven. You know, they really are committed to what we have to offer in the way of dual immersion, in the way of sustainability, and they know that this is a place they can do something that isn't being done at any other school that they've ever seen before.
And Shantelle, we have just a few more seconds, but does it matter to keep teachers year after year?
Oh, it definitely matters. I think it's been a up and down for us. It's difficult because it's a hard job to sustain. We have a longer school day, a longer school year. We have a tougher job to close gaps in a way that I think is hard to sustain over time. But it definitely matters. The longer you have a teacher, the better.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you very much. That's charter schools.